Okay, hello Year 9, this is Mr. Hinchliffe from the History Department, and what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the Lesson 1 of Year 9 History, which will lead us up to about October half term. What you will do is when you come to school, you'll be issued with this booklet, but an online version will be available as well. We are looking at a little bit of the GCSE, but only 10%, so if you are picking GCSE History next year, this is a kind of little bit of a taster for you. So it's based on paper 1. And what this is looking at is the British sector of the Western Front, so during the First World War. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at the trench system, the kind of formation of trenches that were used during the First World War, and we're going to explain how that system may have influenced soldiers' lives, and that's the kind of key thing we want to look at, really influenced the life of soldiers on the Western Front. It's the main things we're going to be looking at. We're going to identify the features of the trench system. So what did it actually look like? We're going to describe them using a little bit of exam question technique, and also look at a couple of sources for us to understand really what it was like to be in those trenches, and was it the same situation throughout the Western Front, throughout the First World War for many soldiers. To start you off though, what I'd like you to do is, and this is in the booklet, is to have a go answering these 5 questions. Some are some general knowledge on the First World War. Other questions are general kind of historical questions, in particular question 3 and question 4. You can do these on the booklet. So if you go to the top of page 3 here, have a go. Once you've done that, pause the video, and then we'll quickly look through the answers. So have a go at these questions now to see what you know, and then pause the video. Okay, so here are the answers. So question 1, the First World War takes place from 1914 to 1918. The area of land where a lot of fighting took place was called no man's land, and even in warfare today, if there's an area of land between 2 attacking sides, the land in the middle is often called no man's land. An inference, this is a key historical skill. You are making an assumption based on knowledge. So if you saw that someone slammed the door after they walked into a room, you would infer that that person is angry. They haven't told you they're angry, but based on your knowledge and your understanding of the world, you can see that that person is angry. So we use inferences a lot in history when we're looking at sources, and we're going to use it a lot in this scheme of work. What kind of source or record would help you understand more about the trench system? Well, a diary would be a good start, maybe the diary of a soldier who had actually fought in the trenches, even a photograph. We've got lots of photographs of the trenches from the First World War. They give us a good insight into what they look like. And finally, the name of warfare during the First World War, it's often referred to as trench warfare. Okay. So just to give you some context, so we call this region the Western Front. This is Western Europe. Here is Calais. Dover is here. So when you guys a couple of years ago, you went to Boulogne, you can see Boulogne there as well when you were in year 7. This year, unfortunately, we can't do it, but you would have been going to Ypres, which you can see here. And Ypres is very close to Calais. It's very close. The line here, as you can see on the key as well, it shows the full extent of what we call the Western Front. So in August 1914, the German army comes through Belgium, invades France, and they are stopped ultimately where you see this line of trenches. The French trenches are blue, so there was a lot of fighting between the French and Germans, particularly here at Verdun. The British sent a force to help defend France. You can see that the red is the British trenches, including Ypres, and we'll look at the Somme as well, although the Somme is not on this map. The Somme is just a bit below, just where the cursor is there. And you also had Belgian trenches as well. So it approximately stretched for 150 kilometres from the English Channel all the way down here to the Swiss border. And for 4 years, or thereabouts, this is how the war is going to be conducted between the French and British and the German army as well. So we want to know what it looks like. Now, it's very easy for us just to think, okay, one trench with the British in one, just a hole in the ground, and on the other side is the Germans. But in fact, the trench system was extremely complicated and complex. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your booklet, and here you will see an artist's impression of the trench system. You've got labels 1 through to 6, and if you go back to the PowerPoint, okay, here you will see the different elements that you need to put in. So we'll model the first one together. So number 1 is looking at this area here where all the fighting is happening, and hopefully from the low stakes quiz you've remembered that this would be no man's land. So no man's land is where you would find lots of shell holes, there's barbed wire, there's dead bodies, there's corpses, there's carcasses of horses. It's a horrible place, but it is where the majority of the fighting takes place. So I recommend you use a pencil. So you've already done no man's land. So you've already done that one. So you've got communication trench, out, front line trench, support trench, and reserve trench. So see if you can work out the other ones. Try and think, okay, what would be front, what would be reserve, what would be support, what might be the dugout, and do it as a process of elimination. So do the ones you know first, and then afterwards see if you can figure out the other ones. So have a go at that. Should take you a couple of minutes, and then pause the video, and then we can look at the answers. Okay, so these are the correct answers. So obviously we know no man's land here. Number 2 is the first line of trenches. This is what's called the front line trench. This is your first line of defense when the enemy attacks you, but it's also your first line of attack if you're going to attack the enemy trench on the other side. So the front line trench is really significant. It would have witnessed the most damage. It would have been shelled. You were at the most vulnerable. You wouldn't have been able to have your head up and over. You would have been, open to enemy fire if you did that, so you'd have to keep quite low down. The conditions are pretty rough in the frontline trench. You're sleeping wherever you can. Many soldiers learn how to sleep standing up. And there's that constant threat of attack. You don't know when the attack might come. It could come at any point during the day, so you've got to be constantly alert. Soldiers in the front line wouldn't spend the entire war there. They would spend up to about 2 weeks, and the trench system had a rotation system in order to keep men and troops fresh throughout the war. Directly behind the frontline trench is the support trench. The support trench was designed to give, as it says in the name, give support to the frontline trench. Men would have been housed in the support trench. They would have been next in line to go into the front line after 2 weeks. But also the support trench acts as a defense barrier. Should the frontline trench be taken by the enemy, as you can see here, the trenches have there's ways that connect them together. The British could have retreated and set up a new line of defense here on the support trench. Number 4 is the reserve trench. That's at the very back. We're talking miles here, really. This is not the school field. This is quite a few miles of trench system. So the reserve trench is quite safe. And from here, again, the soldiers who would have been maybe in the front line would get themselves in the reserve trench, and they're safer, they get themselves refreshed. But again, it's another line of defense. And here behind the reserve trench, you can see the artillery, which would have fired shells at the enemy over all of this. They could fire up to 12 miles away if they wanted to. 5 is the communication trench. You can see it connects the trenches. So here's another example. Here's another example of the communication trench. The communication trench was really significant. As it says in the name, they were able to send messages to each other, to the front line, about attack and defense. Also supplies. If you're on the front line, you need weapons, you need ammunition, you need food, letters home to raise morale. Okay, so the communication trench was really significant. And then finally here, number 6, the dugouts. So the officers would have used these as shelter and as a kind of office. The British ones were rather temporary. They weren't great. The German bunkers were and dugouts were far more advanced, and they'd used concrete actually to build theirs. Okay, so if you go to the booklet, so you should have that filled in correctly now. And based on what I've just talked about, so you might want to go back on the video if you need to and pause and just listen again. We want to describe the function of each of these parts apart from the dugout and the reserve trench. So the example's been done for you here. So it's the communication trench, and it says these were connected the front line to the support trench and the support trench to the reserve trench. They enabled troops and supplies to move from one line to the other, providing protection from snipers and artillery. So what you want to do is, for the front line trench, we'll model this one together, but what was the purpose of it? Well, you'd write something like, this was the first line of defense. Right, this was the first line of defense against the attacking Germans. It also acted as the first line of attack. Soldiers would spend around 2 weeks in the front line trench. Okay, so you've kind of given an idea about what the purpose and the main features, and this is what we're doing. This is an exam style question describing the main features of a particular part. So have a go at the support trench and no man's land. So pause the video, have a go at them, and then we'll move on to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so major thing about what we're going to be doing then is we're going to be looking at some knowledge, but we're also really interested in the sources. And when we do an assessment, we'll be looking at 2 sources, and we'll be trying to answer what they can tell us about a particular aspect of the First World War. So here we're interested in what was it like to be in the trenches. So we've looked at what it was meant to be like with the trench system, which was quite elaborate and complicated and complex. But when we actually look at sources from the First World War, based on soldiers' accounts and photographs, did it match up with the reality? Key thing to know about sources is, first of all, you always have this part in bold, and this is what we call the provenance. So the provenance is based on who wrote the source, what kind of source is it, why did they write it, and we do that through the process of, it's called the nature, the origin, and the purpose. So you always want to consider the type of source, so from here we know it doesn't say a diary, but it just seems to be some sort of account, Walter Cook describing medical conditions. What's the origin? So who wrote it? When did they write it? where did they write it. So we know that this is Walter Cook. He's serving in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he was serving near Ypres in August 1917. And this is really significant because as historians, we look at sources because we want to know whether we can trust them or not, and what do they tell us, what do they reveal, what do they give us an insight into. So already we know this is a soldier who was there at the time. He was at Ypres in August 1917. He's going to be able to add lots of value to what we already know about the Western Front. The second part of the source is always the content. So it's worth just having a look at this. So what I'd like to do is, and this is the best thing to do, is to find certain words and try to start to make inferences. So what does it tell us about the source based on our knowledge? So this says, it rained for 3 solid weeks, and the plight of the men in the trenches in the northern part of Belgium was absolutely impossible. The word plight means difficulty. So for 3 solid weeks, it rained. Imagine being in those trenches for 3 weeks with rain. It's going to be absolutely miserable. How are you meant to do your job effectively? You can't. People had, the mud and the slime all over them, which then caused their uniform to waver more. And this man said that he'd never seen conditions like it. In every trench was 2 feet of water. Many of you will have heard of trench foot. That's it's going to lead to trench foot, isn't it? Your feet been exposed to water, not being able to dry them. It's a horrible feeling for 2 weeks. You can imagine how miserable it would have been to serve in those trenches. So what I'd like to do is to have a read of source B, do the same thing, try to identify some keywords. What does this tell us about what it was like to be in the trenches? And also for source C and source D as well. Okay, once you've done that, that's the first lesson done. And then hopefully you'll be able to be in school for the next one. Okay, any questions, please email your class teacher and we'll be happy to help. Okay, thank you. Bye.